Welcome to Bereans at the Gate. This is our video blog for February 11th. Is that right? Already February 11th in 2019. Welcome. Lots of issues to discuss, guys. We have all sorts of shenanigans still going on in Virginia. We have things going on with the Green New Deal. So let's try to stick to those two topics if we can. Let's start with Virginia. We got to start. I mean, first of all, can you tell the viewers, listeners, where you guys grew up? I mean, I grew up in Indiana. Indianapolis, Indiana in particular, southeast side of Indianapolis. Indiana was at one point a KKK heavy state at different points in its history. By the time I was growing up, though, it had transformed quite a lot. There's still a little bit of racial tension, but nothing significant. So, I mean, Bert, where did you grow up, and how would you describe race relations when you grew up?
Well, I grew up in Upper East Tennessee, which really, in terms of the Civil War, it was non-plantation. It was very pro-Northern, the general area. I'm 60 years old and remember civil rights legislation passing, and I certainly knew individual people that were very demonstrably racist. I don't think I saw a big divide between black and white until we moved to the Memphis, Tennessee area in maybe early 1980s. And at that time, I mean, there were still crosses being burned in people's yards and things of that nature. But Memphis at that time was very broken up. There was only one community that we were aware of that was integrated. So it was a
so still pretty heavily segregated by housing patterns and things like that.
In 84, right.
Yeah. Jeff, what about you?
Yeah, my background, I was in Delaware until I was 10 years old, and I left Delaware in 1974 to move to southern Arkansas. And when we lived in Delaware, I never noticed any of these kinds of things. There was my mom was a teacher, and one of her best friends was a black teacher in the same year group, and her husband was the superintendent of the whole school district. We would go over their house all the time, and I never had any realization about black-white issues when I was in Delaware, but we moved down to southern Arkansas. Oh my, that was a different story in both directions. I mean, there was a decided thing, but that was really only 10 years after the Civil War.
How was it different?
Well, on both sides, obviously thought of the other side as clearly the other side, even though, as usual, and as we would expect to see in the South, football was that great bringer together of things. My school district probably had about 60% white, roughly 40% black, and everybody played football, and so you had lots of close communications, and that kind of helped make things better. But
so when you guys look at this news that's coming out of Virginia with the governor being in blackface at some point for a dance competition, I think he's admitted to that kind of bizarrely. We have the Attorney General who said that he was in blackface for part of a University of Virginia fraternity event, I think, impersonating a rapper. Would this have been anything resembling normal for when you all were growing up? Had you ever heard of anyone in blackface? Is this just a residue of a different kind of culture maybe than what you experienced?
I honestly would have never known that it was offensive, or there was even, I never saw it, never heard of that being. There were other ways that racial conflicts arose, but I didn't see anything like that. So it was foreign to my
nothing like that. Bert?
Not in my circles. Never saw anything of this nature.
So how would racial tensions reveal themselves, though, when you all were growing up?
Oh, it was just usually for us. It would be if there was ever a fight, and there was lots of fights between the guys, and there would clearly be the sides, So,
so it's common for the conflict to be between the two races. Very rarely.
If there was a conflict between any two people, they would align on anything. I still remember one. For instance, this is true, but it's kind of funny. When I was in high school, we couldn't reach agreement in my high school class on the theme song for the whatever our prom or whatever it was called. And what was ironic was all of the African American kids wanted. I forget which band it was, but it was a black band. But all the white kids wanted the Commodores, which was also a black band. but there was disagreement, and they just never did reconcile. They took the issue aside, and eventually, I think they went. Anyway, it didn't matter. But that was just funny.
Bert, what about you? How would racial tensions reveal themselves?
Well, when I was growing up, it would be simply more be manifest in individual people I knew who were very much disliked African American people. But nothing, maybe some tension on the football field a little bit, but again, just simply that was not the world that I came from. I was an adult in Memphis, and like I say, there it was stratified. Like you never had black on white crime in Memphis. It just would not have been tolerated, and everyone intuitively knew it, I believe. So it was just really very separated, almost apartheid-like institutions in the Deep South at that time. And I can remember when I was in seminary, I knew one of the younger pastors who, he was probably in his mid-30s at the time, but taught at the seminary, baptized a black man. And, it wasn't too shortly thereafter to where he had a cross burning in his yard, and that was in the mid-1980s. Wow. You get along the Delta region in our country, and it was a different world altogether than any place I'd ever seen.
Right. So none of us ever spent a lot of time in Virginia. None of us grew up in Virginia. I've been in Virginia periodically since then. I know you all have as well. But fast forward to the 1980s, when you think through, Bert, you've already described some. My experience was that by the time we get into the 1980s, there's a fairly well-defined sense of what's racist and what's not racist. White people are fairly well, regardless of what their hearts may have within them, pretty well knowledgeable of what's accepted to say, what's accepted to do, what would be offensive to other people. And granted, some of those things have changed, but there's a fair bit of sensitivity over racial language and over racial taunts and racial conflict by the time we get to the 1980s. And I guess, was your experience similar? Because I'm trying to figure out what kind of culture they could have been in where this would have been normal and accepted. It's just not one that I can relate to at all.
In terms of the timeline, I am thinking that in the 80s, there were more negative sanctions on whites if you crossed the line, which would have been accepted in the 1970s. Maybe looked at, and maybe that's not fine, but it wouldn't have been punished. In the 80s, there was actual punishment towards those kinds of behaviors in the white culture in some areas of trying. But those attitudes were still there that still had to be kind of excised out through that process.
So you're starting to see consequences.
They're starting to see consequences clearly in the 80s. I can remember people.
I just think what we're seeing here was a lack of maturity. Just an inability. It's not that the people wouldn't have known that what they were doing was inappropriate. It was just they would not take responsibility for their actions like they were shielded students at a university. And I'm sure we still see that behavior in many places where we just don't take full responsibility and accountability for ourselves when we're at a particular age. I know here at Cedarville, some of the time, some of the stuff they do, students do here, to me, I want to say, how stupid can you possibly be? And what in the world are you doing? Don't you have any sense of decorum? And it's more of a cultural thing where they can do what they, whatever it is they're up and about doing.
Right.
And I think that's probably what you had here. It's not that they didn't know it was wrong. It's in a sense they didn't care because they really didn't take accountability for it. It was culturally covered.
Right.
So that's what I think probably was going on. And where I was, at the university where I was, this would not have been tolerated in 5-6 years before the incident with Northam occurred. That would not have come out in a yearbook. It just wouldn't have worked.
So I guess my question then is, should these people lose their jobs for this kind of behavior? So you said it was culturally covered in their senses. I think you're probably right. If it's showing up in yearbooks and other places, there must have been some sort of understanding that this was acceptable, if not encouraged. So is this enough for us to say they deserve to be no longer governor, no longer attorney general? Jeff?
Well, on the blog post today, I wrote that, we really do have to take into consideration this was a long time ago. And I've tried to back off. Clearly, this was a racial issue. But the root cause, the root problem is not about race. It's about selfish pride and just our natural fleshly nature to want to consider ourselves rather than the other person. It's too easy for everybody to be sanctimonious about racism over there when we can picture it somebody else. But as you said, even here at Cedarville, our kids don't do that, but they do other things that are very selfish. The point is, all of us are prone to do that, and we need to see the sin that is within each of us. And so the question is, how do we go forward when we have mistakes in the past? And every one of us knows that we have to repent and turn. I mean, not to be too theological, but every one of us hopes to be a better person tomorrow than we are today. And most people, I can remember, back to the race issue, I talked to an individual in Arkansas that was much older than me about something that they had done, and it was clear that because it had been many, many years earlier, their offense, they were deeply ashamed about that. People tend to grow with time. So in this particular case, it's as I wrote today, I think it's a question of what do those individuals do now? How have they behaved since? Have they shown that this is a character feature which continues on? Or so? I think we have to have some perspective in that.
So you'd want to see more evidence.
Not evidence from then. I want to see more evidence of an ongoing thing.
Like over time, you want to see a pattern.
So there's a pattern, and do people get better? Because people change, and we have to hold out to the fact, to the hope that every one of us can change from our past and become better people.
Bert, what do you think?
I agree with that. Now, I do think there are things that would prohibit one from serving as a governor of a state or a much lesser position.
For example, if you don't mind. What would those be?
Well, something that is illegal and causes a great deal of tangible harm to someone else. I'm not saying that what he did at that time did not cause harm.
That's right.
But I don't know, a crime, a violent crime of some sort. An assault, sexual assault. You know, to me that would prohibit you from, regardless if you had repented, if you had found the Lord and were completely changed and transformed. Still, I'm sorry. This is an outcome of that behavior. I don't think what he did, to me, would fall into the same category as a demonstrable felonious offense. So I can understand him not resigning. Personally, I can see that. At some point in time, we have to turn the tide in our culture, political correctness tide can't just continue to swamp in one direction. So if he's repented, which he obviously has, and if he's lived a life so far, over the last several decades that is in some sense exemplary, which I think he probably has, I don't think he should have to resign for this.
One of the things I was thinking about as I was watching this unfold is, to what extent is he so damaged as a governor or an attorney general that you almost have to resign? Not in the sense that we should be forcing him out of office, but can he be assumed to be at all objective or detached or rational about racial issues for the rest of his term of office? If you're the attorney general and some hot button thing lands on your desk, can we expect you to take a neutral approach now that you've been gone through this ringer of racial issues? I mean, so I wonder whether it's just you're so flawed now moving forward, you're not really capable of doing the kind of job you ought to be doing. So again, I'm not talking about he's committed a sin so grievous he doesn't deserve to serve, but the damage is pretty severe in a state like Virginia. And I think, I don't know, what do you guys
But still,
think?
you're going to have to adjudicate what his behavior has been like as a governor and leading up to the governor. So I don't think there's behavior as a public official. And I understand what you're saying, and I probably would not vote for him if I voted for him in this time. I would not vote for him next time if he continued to run. Now that I can see, but so far as him being removed, I could see him voluntarily stepping down if he chose to. But I understand what you're saying. I don't think it's completely outlandish.
So now we get to the point where we have to talk about our president to some extent. I mean, President Trump's been accused of fairly dramatic things that might qualify as sexual assault by some definitions. Is that enough to say he shouldn't be serving in office now? I mean, granted, he wasn't prosecuted. He didn't undergo cross-examination, production of evidence of witnesses. I get all that, but people might say, well, you're going to be soft on these people in order to protect your own guy or whatever. Is there some inconsistency at work here?
Well, I mean, I didn't vote for Mr. Trump in the first place. and yeah, those same kinds of concerns would have me likely to not vote for him again, even though I like some of his policies. I mean, we can do better is kind of my point. Likewise with the governor of Virginia, I would not be voting for him because of his more recent views on abortion, which are very outrageous. Yeah. So I think that the people can decide that. The interesting thing, the different thing about Mr. Trump is pretty much most of those were known, and the people voted him anyway. So the idea that we should impeach him because of this reprehensible behavior, well, the people have already kind of spoken. Yeah. They voted against impeachment when they voted him in, knowing those kinds of things. But that doesn't mean we have to vote him again the next time.
Yeah. So if there's anything he does while he's sitting as president or governor, that's sort of a whole.
That's a whole different situation. Yeah. But that gets back to the timing of it.
I'd agree. Well, it's tempting to jump into the Green New Deal, but probably not prudent to do it. So let's push off the Green New Deal maybe till our next video blog. So thank you to all of our listeners, all of our viewers. These microphones are here because we're in the process, hopefully, of constructing a podcast. These will give us a better sound, I've been told, and hopefully that will be coming out here pretty soon. So,
and is it a good possibility they might not have to look at our mugs?
It's very possible. It's very possible, which would probably be best for all involved. That's right. So thank you very much.